Tonight's meeting is sponsored by the Environmental Action Team. Our intention is to educate about some of our league's positions on natural resources. John Sanderson, introducing John
Over here.
is from the Nature Conservancy, a group that for over 50 years has safeguarded some of the most remarkable places on Earth for you and for future generations. John is Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy.
Not technology, not technology. Science, not technology.
For the Nature Conservancy of Colorado. And I just found out that he is living in Fort Collins, so he's even closer to our hearts. Thank you. He leads a staff of scientists whose work touches a wide range of conservation challenges, including planning for natural habitats, yes, in growing metro areas, that's us, prescribing management of healthy forests, developing grazing plans that also conserve natural landscapes, and adapting to our changing climate. After earning his bachelor's degree of science in engineering from Purdue University and a Master of Science in botany from the University of Vermont, John got his start in Colorado in 1994, doing field inventory and conservation planning for the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. He later earned his PhD in the graduate degree program in ecology, researching intermountain wetlands in Colorado's San Luis Valley, and has worked for the Nature Conservancy since 2006. John is passionate about figuring out how to maintain Colorado's natural treasures as our population explodes and our world continues to warm. And we are so passionate about learning how we can help.
Awesome.
And help me welcome Dr. John Sanderson from the Nature Conservancy of Colorado.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Vicki, for the invitation. Thank you, Nancy, for being here. So good to see you after too long a time. And Martha, thank you for coming out as well, and the rest of you. I also want to point out Cynthia in the back there, who also, Cynthia is my colleague at the Nature Conservancy, and she is also a point for more information on the Nature Conservancy, even if it's just about communication. But Cynthia also manages our Legacy Club, where folks who want to leave us in their estate can help support our work. And hopefully, after my somewhat less inspiring talk today, less inspiring because I can't figure out how to get the videos to work, because the videos were awesome. But the videos will work, but I just don't have any sound. I could maybe just, I could talk now. Sing and make the music. But hopefully the rest of the content you'll find at least interesting and hopefully a bit inspiring and maybe a little bit terrifying at the same time. I really, really, really like dialogue. And so I'm going to go through the slides and then we'll have plenty of time to talk. We have to be out of here apparently by 9, but I'm willing to stick around as long as anyone else wants to stick around, either as a full group or if folks want to stick around after that to ask me any additional questions as well. So, and I have a voice that carries, so I'm going to try to manage this so that it is not too overwhelming. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in here. So we are the Nature Conservancy. So by a show of hands, who knows the Nature Conservancy? Who knows our work? So almost everyone. That's really awesome. We actually have nationwide, we have only about an 8% name recognition. So we actually do kind of live in a bubble here in Fort Collins, and it's really awesome because our commitment to these kinds of things are super great. But just very quickly, a little bit about who we are, because even for those who know the Nature Conservancy, I find out that sometimes we are still conceived of as really a land protection organization, which we do. We still buy a lot of land, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a story that property we just bought 2 weeks ago. But we are a very different organization than we were even 13 years ago when I started working for the Nature Conservancy after doing my PhD here at CSU. So we're in 72 countries, so we really are a global organization with very much a global agenda. I work for Colorado, but I do have a lot of opportunities to work with other programs across the country and occasionally overseas as well. We're the world's largest nonprofit, which comes with its pros and cons. The biggest pro that I really like is we have a capacity to really have impact at a really extraordinary scale. And the commitment to being science-based, I'm the director of science. My job is to make sure that all of the work we do is truly grounded in really good science. And so it's not just a view that I hold, but I can actually point to the data and say, this is why we need to do this thing. And that's my job to make sure that happens. And the commitment to science, the science-based approach to our work is really deep and strong throughout the organization. And that's one reason why I really like working for TNC. We are, like the League, we're nonpartisan. And so that means that if you look at our board of trustees, for example, you will see as many R's as you do D's on our board of trustees for here in Colorado. And we do advocate. We advocate for the things that we want to see go forward, but we studiously avoid getting into partisan debates because we work every bit as much across the aisle as we possibly can. So we work closely with Michael Bennett, whose wife was on our board a while back, Senator Bennett, and we also work closely with Cory Gardner. So we're very happy to work with both sides of the aisle. And by the way, if you missed the news just a couple of weeks ago, those two senators were instrumental in the renewal of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was just a huge outcome that'll continue to provide hundreds of millions of dollars every year towards really important conservation work. And we had a piece to play in that, but we certainly didn't do it alone. And we are very interested in outcome-oriented stuff. So we want to see differences on the ground from our work. We're not interested in just changing policy. Policy is super important, but we do a lot more than that. So let me see. So this is, I'm actually not going to try to narrate this, but I will show you some other nice pictures. It is a little unfortunate we don't get to see this. This is a video about some Colorado highlights in the last year, but I'm going to skip through it because, yeah, it's a lot more interesting than if actually hearing the voice. And my apologies that we weren't able to get the audio to work. But this is actually a more fun part of the story I want to tell. We live in an amazing place. That is Colorado. So who knows, who considers themselves at least an amateur botanist in here? Okay, so Jane, I'll put you on the spot. How many species of plants in Colorado?
Oh, 542.
Close, except there are 3,000. Just off by just an order of magnitude. But we have an extraordinary diversity of life in Colorado, and this is really, really expressed in our plant life. It's also expressed in our mushrooms, of which there are also about 3,500 species of mushrooms in Colorado. These are just a few that I pulled off my phone from the last year. That, you know, whenever I go out with my daughter and go hiking, you know, we try to play games to see how many different species we can find. It's a really fun game. And it's really common that in any given outing we'll find 50, 70, 90 species of wildflowers in any given hike. And this is just a glimpse at the extraordinary diversity that turns me on. I'm a botanist by training, and I really love this stuff. I particularly like this guy right here. Does anyone know who this is? I would be really surprised if anyone did. This is a bladderwort, and it's got these little pods on the leaves that are traps. And when little microorganisms in the water swim into one of those traps, the trap snaps shut and the plant dissolves it. And so it's a carnivorous plant. It's one of just a couple of carnivorous plants here in Colorado. The hand is not at risk though, because it only eats microorganisms. This is some of our bird life in Colorado, just a small sampling.
Can you tell your phone?
And no, these are, if anyone, I took this one at City Park just 2 days ago. And I was about 250 feet away from this bird, and it's with this little point and shoot camera. And if anyone wants to know what that is, then look at my Twitter feed and you'll see that. I list it's a Canon, it's an older Canon model, but it's extraordinary. I took this ring-billed gull as well. This is a common goldeneye. This bobolink was from the west side of Fort Collins over in, what's that new natural area, the Ridgeview natural area off of Overland. That bobolink is a special bird in Colorado. We don't see a lot of those. So I learned this just the other day too, that Colorado is the only state in the country that's not on the edge of the country that has over 500 species of birds. So that's pretty cool too. We have a real extraordinary diversity of birds. If anyone is interested, we do the thing, we're doing an event on May 18th, it's a Saturday. We call it the Protected Lands Birding Challenge. It's a competition among TNC programs, and the various TNC programs get people on properties that we have protected, and TNC in Colorado has protected over 1 million acres of land, and we're also one of the largest private landowners in the state. We own about 350,000 acres of land. So we get crews of birders out on all these properties, and we record as many species of birds as we can find in one day. And it's a really fun event to have 24 hours of trying to find as many birds as we can. Last year we tallied 219 species on our properties in just 24 hours. So really fun stuff. So the bluebird down here and this grouse were from last year in that challenge. So anyway, this is what turns me on. This turns me on as well. I work a lot, and my PhD is around water. Water is a real specialty of mine. This is a really good year for water because we're at about 130% of normal snowpack so far. So it's not just avalanches. It also means it's going to be a good runoff year, particularly in the southwest where last year was excruciatingly dry. And this year it's going to be much better. So these are some of our native fish. These are all Colorado River fish. They're all native Colorado fish. They're mostly ugly, and they're really interesting. Like this guy right here, this guy can grow to 6 feet. This is the Colorado pike minnow. And it's actually, it used to be called the white salmon because it's migratory. And this guy will migrate over 200 miles between where it lives, where it forages in non-breeding years, and then it'll migrate 200 miles to the place where it breeds, and then its young will disperse back off again. Yeah, so they're mostly ugly, but really fascinating fish. You'll notice that several of them have kind of a hump on their shoulder. These are different species, they all have a hump, and we speculate that that's about aerodynamics in the Colorado River, which is a really harsh and dynamic river system. 42 species about in the Colorado River originally. So when John Wesley Powell floated down the Colorado, there were just over 40 species of native fish. Now there are twice as many non-native fish as native fish in the Colorado River system. And we're trying to get these guys to hang on. One of the problems with our we use a lot of water. We live in a dry state, even though we have a lot of runoff. But among these fish, these 4 are all endangered. The guy at the top, the bony tail, I refer to him as functionally extinct, which means the only reason we find him in the rivers at all these days is because we grow a lot of them in hatcheries and we dump them in the rivers. The other 3 are reproducing, but they still struggle. The one on the bottom, the Colorado pike minnow, is showing the greatest signs of some recovery, but the other 3 are still really challenged. And so to segue a little bit from what inspires me and what I think is really cool about this stuff into what the challenges are. and what we're doing to work on these challenges. So this is one of the challenges. This is again the Colorado River. And so, we work on the east slope, we work on the west slope, but I like this chart because it's really illustrative. The pink line that moves up and down along the top there is natural stream flow going all the way back to 1923, and that dark blue line that's inexorably rising is the water we take out of the river. Yeah, and so you can see that somewhere around 2000, the water that we take out of the river met the amount of water in the river. And so the Colorado River is kind of famous because we use every single drop in the Colorado River, and we send it, so the river starts on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, flows 1,400 miles, and then flows out into the Sea of Cortez, which is in Mexico, of course. And we send over the border only exactly as much water as we have to send across the border through an international treaty, because otherwise we're using every drop of water we can out of that river. So these guys, this is a really cool set of birds among our 507 birds that have been recorded in Colorado. It's greater sage grouse in the upper left, sharp-tailed grouse in the upper right here, lesser prairie chicken in the lower left, and Gunnison sage grouse. And look at this guy, I mean, that's a beauty, isn't it? Yeah, can you imagine what's happening there? That's a boy. And he's showing off. Boys are a little unusual, I mean, birds are a little, maybe a lot of you know this, but among birds, it's the boys who are the flashy ones who try to show off. And these guys are all, they all nest on the ground, and they all do this behavior. And by the way, these guys, so these are northwest Colorado, the greater sage grouse. This sharp-tailed grouse, one subspecies lives in northwest Colorado with those guys, but this guy's from northeast Colorado, this guy's southeast Colorado, and this guy's southwest Colorado. And I think they're divided up for a real reason, because they're closely related, but they mostly cannot really coexist. But what you see here in every one of these cases is that the males converge on these dance grounds that we call leks, L-E-K. And the bird's lek, it's a verb, it's a noun and it's a verb. And so the birds, they strut their stuff by blowing up these sacs on and showing off their feathers and stuff. And then the females come along. You can see a couple females up in that upper left, and they pick the male that they want to mate with. Turns out like 80% of the males all pick the same guy, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, these guys, to a species, are imperiled. This one is on the Endangered Species Act list as a threatened species. There are about 5,000 of these guys that still exist in the entire world. The greater sage grouse up in the upper left, there's still a couple 100,000 of them, but that's only about 5 to 10% of what population was here when we started moving out west 150, 200 years ago. The lesser prairie chicken in the lower left is in really tough shape. And so these guys live on the ground, so they're really subject to predation. But probably most interesting is that these guys really don't like structure. Because they're used to nesting on the ground, so that means they're really attentive to hawks and any place that a hawk can perch. And so if there's anything tall, they won't nest near it because they're afraid a hawk will perch on it. So when we build grain silos and oil rigs and buildings and telephone poles, whatever, these guys will no longer nest around that stuff. And they've really shown a lot of decline because of that. So these kinds of developments are illustrated in this map. This map was produced by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, which is where I got my start in Colorado. They're a program at CSU, great group of folks. This map illustrates what we call the Landscape Disturbance Index. And wherever you see red, the land is very disturbed. So that's Front Range, agricultural areas, and river bottoms is really what you see on that map. And the yellow is a moderate level of disturbance. And so even though Colorado's big and beautiful, we've also had a big impact on the state. And we all know the sort of the ultimate source of that impact is this, right? So this is population growth over time. We're about here. We're at a little bit less than 6 million. And I've actually, when I saw this is a recent projection. I used to be saying we'd be 10 million by 2050, but this projection has us at 8 million by 2050, which is not as many as 10 million, but it's still, 2 million plus more than we have now. And so this is going to continue to put pressure on our ecosystems, as will this. So on the x-axis is temperature, on the y-axis is temperature, that vertical axis over there, down the bottom is years. This is the 20th century of temperature in Colorado. So this is based on actual data. This isn't modeled, it isn't projected, it isn't speculated. It's actual data. If you you could do this yourself, you can go around and collect all the data from the National Weather Service weather stations all the way back to 1900, and if you plot them, you will see this trend. And what we know is that in the past 50-ish years, Colorado has gotten about 2.5 degrees warmer. And these lines, these straight dashed lines, show the trend. If you go all the way back to the 20th century, there's a moderate trend, but it looks like the trend is increasing. The warming trend, it looks like it's increasing. And we can project this out. And if we do project this out, if we stay business as usual, we're going to be several degrees warmer again in another couple of decades. So if you haven't yet seen any of Catherine Hayhoe's presentation, she's a climate scientist at Texas Tech, and she's an amazing climate communicator. She gave a talk at CSU just last Thursday, and it was really excellent. And I stole a couple of her ideas, as I told her I would. And this is the one that, there are two charts here. This is from a Yale program on climate change communication and a couple of collaborators they work with. And you can click through a whole bunch of survey questions that they do every year across the US. So this question is, global warming will harm people in the US. Do you think that's true or not? And the percentage of people who indicate yes, who respond yes, is shown. If you're a yellow or orange or red color, that means people say yes to this question. So across most of the country, people are saying yes, global warming is happening and it will harm people in the US. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. And I could show you a whole bunch of other charts from this as well. This is a really interesting website to check out. But the one I really want to share with you is this one, which is global warming will harm me personally. Almost no one thinks that global warming will affect them personally. And if I do nothing else tonight, aside from getting you to be a Nature Conservancy supporter, I want to disabuse you of the notion that climate change will not harm you personally. And the reason, well, I'll go through a couple of reasons why it may already be harming you personally. You just haven't made the connection. So how many people ski or go snowshoeing or something like that? Right? Okay, so more than half of us. Every one of those red dots is a place where the snowpack is measurably less now than it was 50 years ago. The bigger the dot, the bigger the decline, and you can see that some of those declines are 80% and more. In most places in Colorado, the snowpack has declined. So don't be fooled by this big year. And one thing Dr. Hayhoe said last week was, I said earlier that temperature has increased by 2.5%, and that's true, but there are a whole bunch of other dynamics around climate change that are really important to be aware of as well. And one is about extremes. So 2013, that big flood had a climate fingerprint on it. This snowpack is climate fingerprint. I'll walk through a couple more. That's my little girl when she was 4 or 5. We were up at the Wool Festival in Estes Park when High Park Fire was burning back in 2012. And this is the Silver Creek Fire from 2018. Last year, over 500,000 acres in Colorado burned. Second largest year on record in Colorado. This chart down here shows the number of large wildfires across the West. So this is also just data, it's not modeling. This is what we've already seen. The number of large wildfires across the West in the past 50 years, 40 years has about tripled, okay? So if you were here in High Park, and I imagine a lot of you were, when you were breathing that nasty air that we were breathing in town for a bunch of weeks, that had a climate fingerprint on it. So this is the famous bathtub ring on Lake Powell, right? That's like 100 feet. The reservoir's way down at record lows. Powell, along with Lake Mead, are the two big buckets that anchor the Colorado River water system. This chart over here, I love. So this line, where all these blue arrows are, is the Continental Divide. All of those blue arrows are places where we put a pipe or a ditch in the Colorado River and bring it over the divide so that we can use it. So when you turn on your tap here in Fort Collins, about half the water coming out of that tap actually originated on the other side of the Continental Divide, and it's from the Colorado River. So that's sort of a really interesting point, and relevant because this red line indicates the long-term trend in flows in the Colorado River. And we know that over about the past 100 years, the flow in the Colorado River has declined about 15%. About half of that decline is from climate. So if you pay attention to the news on this stuff, as I do as part of my work, you see multiple articles every single day about how Arizona and California aren't cooperating as we try to finalize a drought contingency plan for the Colorado River. And so right now, for a whole bunch of legal water rights reasons I can't go into here, but I'd happy to entertain later, a lot of the front range water rights would be, in the current construct, the first ones to be cut off if this decline continues. So there's a lot of very heated negotiations going on already on this topic. My last climate impacts that you are already feeling is this one. So the top is 100-degree plus days through 2016. So I think I see a trend there. And the bottom one is from Denver's website. You can go on and find this tonight if you want to go look into this more. These are projections down here. In the last part of the 20th century, about 5 days north of 95 degrees each summer. I think we're already experiencing more than that. And by 2050 or so, we're going to be expecting 35 days a year. And by the end of the century, if we stay on the track we're on, we're going to, pretty much the entire summer is going to be upper 90s. So there you have it. That's the inspiring part of the talk. I'll try to move on and tell you what we can do about it, because one of the things that I believe deeply and I already see happening is that our choices matter. And so this is a theme of the league, right? I mean, so you all can actually make a difference, and our choices actually matter. And so all over the place, I'm seeing a lot of signs of great things happening. I'm going to walk through a few of the things that the Nature Conservancy is doing. So on the right here are our goals out of our current strategic plan. We work on multiple major topics. We still do land protection, but we also work on water. We also work on forest restoration and the fire problem, and we also work on cities, and we do a lot of policy work. And I'm these days working on climate pretty much every day with some exciting movement there. And I'm really sorry that this is a nice video here. This is, I can actually tell you about this, because that's me carrying the bucket. And this is a fun little video where we've created a couple of these where we just do literally 90 seconds of science. One of the water outcomes that I'm most proud of in the last couple of years is that in 2017, we had the Southwest Colorado had a big snow year. And on the Dolores River, where there's a big main stem dam called McPhee Dam, and it's had a huge impact on the river. And when they do release water from the dam, they didn't think about river health at all. But we worked many years, 10 years plus, in a coalition of folks trying to convince the Bureau of Reclamation and the water users that when you release water, let's release it in the most optimal way for the river health. And so we constructed a bunch of plans, like when we get the big water year, we're going to release it in this way. And we released more water and created a bigger flood than we had in about 15 years on this river. One of the things we want to do with that flood is flush sediment down the river so that the fish have breeding habitat and they require clean cobbles to breed. But we wanted to know, did this actually work? Did we actually get young fish? So what I'm doing in that video is with a bunch of Colorado Parks and Wildlife staff seining for young fish. We'd capture those fish, put them in a net, we'd measure them, and if they're big enough, weigh them, write down the species, and then throw them back in the river. But then that way, we know whether or not the fish we're interested in are actually reproducing. And all three of the native species that we were real concerned about in that instance had reproduced in that year. So that was super exciting news. We also work in forests, as I mentioned. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were able to report that since the beginning of our strategic plan 2.5 years ago, we've put prescribed fire on over 10,000 acres of forest in Colorado and northern New Mexico. It's a really big number, but it's still short of the 30 or 40,000 acres we think we need to keep our forests healthy. Western forests burn. They always have, and they always will. Our question is, how are we going to manage that? And it's pretty clear after 100 years of fire suppression that fire suppression isn't actually the most effective strategy. Sometimes it's super important, but a more effective strategy is to manage fire-prone forests as fire-prone forests, which means sometimes allowing them to burn, and then if this is done right, the next time the burn comes through, they don't find as much fuel, and the trees are a lot more resistant to those future burns. So we get out there working in close collaboration with the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, Colorado Forest Service, the Peaks to People Water Fund, which we helped stand up with the Center for Collaborative Conservation out of CSU, that works right here in the Poudre watershed to make sure that the water filtering and sediment retention things that forests do, not to mention habitat, all are maintained in this watershed that supplies a big chunk of our water here in Fort Collins. So this is Fisher's Peak. So I imagine some of you have driven south on I-25 to the New Mexico border. And if you make that drive, Right before you hit New Mexico, if you look to your left, if you're driving south, you'll see a peak. It's the last property just east of I-25, and that peak you see is called Fisher's Peak. And it's a 19,000 acre property that we closed on, Cynthia, what, 10 days ago? Yeah, 10 days ago, 19,000 acres. Yeah, so really fabulous outcome. It gets a little bit better. So those are the Spanish peaks in the distance there, really beautiful. The San Luis Valley, where I did my PhD work, is just a little bit west of there. The really great news about this is we're working with Great Outdoors Colorado and Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the city of Trinidad with the intention, long way to go between here and there, but if we get the outcome we want, this is going to be Colorado's next state park and the first park in over 3 decades. So yeah, that'll be a really cool outcome. We're trying to get into cities. We have a city program that's only a couple years old now, and trying to figure out what our spaces are. Even though we do more than land protection now, we mostly work on natural places, but we also know that the United States is now 80% urban. We're 80% urban. And we also know in the world is over 50% urban now. And the world is headed to 80% urban. So people have a lot less contact with nature these days. And of course, we're all looking at our screens pretty regularly. I gotta make sure that, okay, I think I'm okay for now. So we're trying to do 2 things in cities, well, more than 2, but 2 basic ideas. One is make cities more livable places. And so we're starting with a tree planting program and some regional conservation planning in the Denver metro area. We know trees have tons of great health benefits and aesthetic benefits and air pollution benefits and so on, air quality benefits. We also know, it's very, very well documented in the science literature now, that being in touch with green stuff is good for you. I think we're really lucky here in Fort Collins because particularly the Old Town, and I think the southern part of the town is going to catch up. We've got really good tree canopy and lots of great open spaces and so forth. But Denver doesn't have all of that, particularly some of the neighborhoods on the north side of Denver and northeast side of Denver, where their tree canopy is much lower and they have a long history of industrial development. So we're working there to make cities more livable. We're doing this all across the country and indeed all across the world. We're also trying to just connect people with nature because we think our, not only TNC supporters, but supporters of nature in the future are going to be people who grew up in cities. And so we want to make sure that they have some connection. John Stokes, by the way, who runs our Natural Areas program, I'm sure many of you know him. John told me a few years ago that the Poudre River sees 1.5 million user days every year. Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, it's a really fabulous resource. Yeah, it is hard to believe, but it's like, I mean, so many people use that place. It's really extraordinary. We do policy work, and this particular effort, Keep It Colorado, was about renewing Great Outdoors Colorado. So Great Outdoors Colorado is funded by lottery funds, and they spend about somewhere between $40 and $50 million a year on open space and land protection and parks and all kinds of wonderful things that keep Colorado beautiful. And so we worked with a coalition of partners to get the lottery reauthorized so that it would continue to fund GOCO and we would be able to continue to spend that money. GOCO is spending, I think, $10 million on the Fisher's Peak project. So huge, big important source for land protection. And GOCO helped with, I know they helped with Roberts Ranch up across from the Forks. I'm pretty sure they helped with Soapstone. I see some nods from people who know more than I do. I think they helped with Red Mountain Ranch, the Larimer County open space. So GOCO has been a huge asset for us over the years. At all these open spaces, you'll see little signs that mention GOCO. So take a look for that. And then on policy, this as well. So I mean, the climate issue is truly global. I was just challenged. I actually sat out in the hallway earlier today as I was having my latest climate conversation. We're doing a series of roundtables with conservative-leaning business people, and that's really interesting. Because it hadn't been bad enough earlier. So we're doing a series of roundtables, and where we're just convening folks to say, look, this is a really important issue. Let me show you the science, and let's talk about the solutions. We're collaborating with Bill Ritter's, Governor Ritter's Center for the New Energy Economy, also here at CSU, to try to build a coalition in the middle that's going to help move really meaningful climate policy forward. And just today, I was challenged by, well, so Colorado's a small state, and, our emissions are only a tiny fraction of the global emissions, so why should we commit to 45% emissions reductions by 2030, which is the goal that came out of that Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change 1.5 degree report last November. I wouldn't recommend that one, by the way. It's 1,500 pages. But the National Climate Assessment that also came out on Black Friday last year is really interesting. There's a Southwest section that includes Colorado. But in any case, Colorado matters. And everything that you all are doing and we all are doing here in Fort Collins and in our own lives really matters as well. And I'm super proud of Fort Collins and everyone, Susan and others, who have really stood up for and held tight to the climate commitments that Colorado has made. It's super, super awesome. And let's keep going around that because we got a lot of work to do. And this is my last really inspiring video. And this is a global video, which I'm not even going to try to narrate. But anyway, there we are. Thank you. Can you watch the video? You sure can watch the video, yeah. Does have a few words, I guess. This is a global take on not only the work the Nature Conservancy does across the world, but just the importance of this work. And I think one thing that the Nature Conservancy has really come to not to terms with, that's the wrong word. Our mission was to protect the land and water to support all biodiversity up until about 10 years ago. And then we changed our mission to say our mission is to protect the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And the reason for that change is because we have really just come to realize, and the conservation community in general has come to realize, that we cannot separate people from these natural ecosystems. And they unfortunately can't separate themselves from us. So there's just a very powerful interdependence across all people and all systems that we need to really be cognizant of so that we can make the right decisions for managing ecosystems all across the globe.
That's great.
It's pretty, isn't it? When the sound's playing, this one brings me to tears, actually. And I've seen it several times. So thank you. I don't know if you can find them on the website. Do you know, Cynthia, if those are? I don't know. But I can find out. And Vicki or whomever, if there are questions about follow-ups that I can provide, I'll be happy to respond to that. Yes?
You talked about the temperature of the air in Colorado. Can you comment on the long-term trend in the air pollution levels in Colorado?
Yeah, well, last week it wasn't very good either. And I had a little bit of an issue with the Denver Post article that said you can blame an inversion on our bad air quality, because I don't think the inversion is actually to blame. The inversion is when the pollution gets trapped down near ground level, and it was really bad last week. I mean, we are still non-compliant with even EPA standards, so we're still out of bounds. And we know, as I understand it, the two biggest contributors currently are, there are multiple contributors, but transportation, all the cars we drive, and the oil and gas activity have both been big contributors to that current poor air quality in this area. Yeah. Yeah. The question was, what are the most critical ecosystems that we should be working on right now in Colorado? And there are a few that we need to be working on simultaneously. So for sure, grasslands. And particularly on the interface where we're growing very rapidly out into eastern Colorado, although we also do the big land protection opportunities are farther east where the growth hasn't occurred yet. But the reason I mentioned grasslands first is because they are the most transformed and least protected ecosystem on the entire globe. So we often get attracted to the alpine ecosystems in Colorado. They're actually pretty well protected. They're public land, they're managed pretty well, and that's true across much of the globe. But our grasslands have been massively transformed and not a whole lot of protected areas, which is one reason why we're so excited about that Fisher's Peak project. Our rivers are in tough shape. About half of the species in all of Colorado are currently imperiled. And a lot of that is because of water development. It's also because of water quality. And it's because of non-native species that eat their native species. So figuring out how we can manage our water in a way where we can take better care of our rivers at the same time that we can also take our showers in the morning and cook and grow our crops and things like that. The forest issues for these lower elevation forests, like the ponderosa pine that you walk through up in Horsetooth or Laurie State Park, those forests historically burned every 15 or 30 years. They burned often. And the burning actually made them resilient because the ponderosa pine in particular are really adapted to fire. Now these forests, these lower elevation forests, if you've looked at John Fielder's book, for example, it shows the 19th century and 20th century photos. You can see that our forests are quite a bit more dense now. And so when there is a fire, it's much more likely to get up into the crowns. When it gets into the crown, it kills the trees. And of course, that has water quality implications. When Hike Park fire burned, we had to shut off half of our water supply. So we get water from two sources, the Poudre River and this Colorado River water, which comes through Horsetooth Reservoir underneath Rocky Mountain National Park. And we had to shut off the Poudre River for, I think, most of 2 years. So the rivers still need a lot, the forests still need a lot of attention as well. And then I would lastly say our sagebrush ecosystems, which are another underprotected ecosystem across Western North America. And a lot of those critters, including the greater sage grouse, are quite imperiled at the moment and still declining. And we got to figure out what's going on there and make sure that we don't lose them. Yeah, so the question was, given the importance of science, I'll paraphrase, are we bringing the right science to bear, and do the decision makers really have the scientists on their panels and commissions and so forth? So Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a lot of scientists and quite a lot of good ones. They actually have a research department, but that's a relatively small part of the 600-plus person agency. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife is also, their primary source of funding is hunting and fishing revenue. And so their primary clientele, they take their non-game stuff very seriously, but their primary clientele is people who hunt and fish. And so it's a funding model that is proving problematic because the number of hunters are continuing to decline. And so that means their revenue is declining. There was just a big fix that passed the General Assembly in Colorado last spring, but that fix is only going to last so long, and in time, we're going to have to figure out a different funding model. And but the Colorado Parks and Wildlife folks also draw on a lot of other science. Fort Collins is a hotbed of extraordinary ecological science with U.S. Forest Service, USGS, National Park Service, the university, and so I don't think there is a shortage of science, but I think that sometimes one of my personal missions is to continue to figure out how to connect that science with the people who are really making the decisions, and I think that still remains a bit of a challenge. Yeah. So the question was, how do we think about the concept of native species and the protection of those native species, given that we've transformed the landscape massively, not only by introducing other species, but in a lot of other ways as well. And it's a great question. I actually, I helped the city, I played a smallish role with the city in producing a report that we call the Ecological Response Model for the Poudre River. And so this is a model that the city used in developing their comments on a couple of the big water projects, particularly Northern Integrated Supply Project. And in this model, we spent a lot of time thinking about how the river works. And what I saw really clearly in doing that work is that the Poudre River is not classically natural. It's not natural in an 18th century sense. It's not native in that sense. We do still have cottonwood trees, which were the original trees that were there, three actually kinds of cottonwoods that grow along the Poudre. But you can see, if you've seen any of those old pictures of the Poudre, you see these wide open meadows and some scattered cottonwood trees, and now we've got a pretty dense forest. One of the codominants, one of the biggest, most common trees down there is crack willow, which is a non-native species. The dominant understory is green ash, which, by the way, is going to get killed by emerald ash borer when it arrives here, which it will. And then rivers are really dynamic ecosystems. They move. But stand on the banks of the Poudre, just east of College, where they're putting the Whitewater Park in, and ask yourself, can this river move? The answer is absolutely not, because it's pinned in by the diversion structure that's just west of College. It's pinned in by the bridge over College. It's going to be pinned in by the Whitewater Park and the development that's immediately south and immediately north of the river. So it's not a natural river. And at the same time, it has extraordinary value for the people of Colorado. And it's a wonderful place to go birding in May. And there's still some native fish, and even the brown trout, which is one of the 100 most invasive species in the entire world. But people love catching brown trout on the Poudre River in town here. So I'm actually, along with the Nature Conservancy, and I think many of us in conservation are having to think that at the same time that we continue to use this concept of native as a guidepost and what did things look like 200 years ago, we also have to incorporate the reality that there are precious few ecosystems on this earth that we haven't impacted. And how do we think about that? And how do we incorporate that into our vision for the future? And I don't personally entirely have the answer to that yet, but I'm working on it. So the question was, up in an area like Risk Canyon, where most of the homes are on wells, how does the well water use affect water generally in Colorado? Mostly not very much. because well water use, you're probably limited to, you have some cap on how much you can pump, but you can't irrigate a field. The impacts on the water system that's much beyond where you live are probably pretty minimal, even with that outdoor water use, because even the outdoor water use is relatively contained, gardens and watering your horses and your hot tub. That's not a huge impact. Now, when you start watering big lawns and such, as we do here in town, then you start really having a very noticeable impact. And on the Front Range, up and down the Front Range, that outdoor water use, which you are not allowed to do, at least in theory, up and down the Front Range, outdoor water use, water for landscaping, consumes 50% of all the water we consume on the Front Range of Colorado. So it's a huge number to keep those lawns green. On the indoor water use, so what you use on your indoor use, you might pump 100 gallons. You probably only consume, that's the technical word for it, 10. Meaning that most, like when you take a shower, some of that water evaporates, most of it goes back down down the drain, and then it goes into a leach field, and a lot of that percolates back into the groundwater. So you've got a little bit of natural recycling hit there as well. So I think mostly in most places, that kind of incidental, that small scale residential groundwater use is not hugely impactful. Yeah, it's a really big deal, actually, especially when you drive through the Vale area and they've got all those elk fences along the way. So even if an elk wants to try to get out on the highway and kill itself, it can't. There are some groups working with the Department of Transportation to try to put in some overpasses, even on I-70. But the fragmentation generally with highways and subdivisions and power lines and all that stuff, it all adds up. So that map I showed earlier, where the red indicates the really high impact, if any highway you look at, any one of those interstates you look at, it's going to be bright red. Yeah, so it's a problem, and we need to continue to think about how we can minimize that impact.
What are some ideas about how we can?
Yeah, so what's happening in just a couple of Colorado areas is they're actually going to build some overpasses. So for the animals. No, overpasses that'll be like a big wide bridge that the animals can find, and they will find it. And in other areas you can build underpasses as well. We don't have a lot of examples of this yet in Colorado, but in other parts of the country, they do already have examples of this. And I know there are at least a couple plans in the works for overpasses here in Colorado. And so we'll see if that goes. They're very expensive though. So, it's a retrofit that we'd rather not have to do. But whether it's for lynx or elk or whatever, pretty much the whole central part of Colorado around Vale, animals can't get north to south right now. They're blocked. So we need to fix that. Yeah, we're not personally engaged on that right now though. Well, it's a good question. What would I be if I were in the administration? What would I be thinking about? I would certainly, one thing that I would for sure do, I'm going to pretend like I'm king for a minute and kind of can do, or a city planner. I would make sure that they're looking at those places for important habitats and important critters that are still using them, particularly the place up by Anheuser-Busch. But over here by Hughes Stadium as well. And to the extent that we find habitats and ecosystems of particular importance, then I would ask the developer to figure out a way to incorporate the preservation of those habitats into their plan. I also would, if I could, think about water use in those places, because whether it's energy on the climate side or water, these are limited resources, and we certainly can't make more water. We can make more energy, but I'll tell you another stunning statistic about energy If you project the amount of renewables, wind turbines and solar panels we will need to supply all of the western US if we convert entirely to renewables, it will cover an area the size of Utah. So with respect to water, with respect to electricity, use less. So those are a couple of things I do. But I also reminded myself of another anecdote. So we put, thanks in part to incentives from the city and the state, we have solar panels on our roof. As soon as we put solar panels on our roof, I started paying attention to our electricity consumption. And over the course of about 5 years, after doing an energy audit, replacing a couple of appliances, we reduced our energy consumption by 40% in our home. So that was just one home, and if we can do the same thing around water, then we're a long ways towards, living here more sustainably. Yeah, thanks for your question.
If we
We'll
stay on
get
the
there.
trajectory of temperature increasing, what will Colorado look like in 50 years?
North Texas, yeah. The question was, if we stay on the business as usual trajectory, what will Colorado look like in 50 years? The New York Times actually did a thing. Actually, they first did it a couple years ago, but they reran it recently. So you can probably find this where you can look up your city and see what other city of today your city is going to feel like in 50 years. And I'm pretty sure I'm remembering correctly that we're going to feel like North Texas. Yeah.
These are our kids.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
You mentioned the Land Conservation Act that was recently passed. Can you comment on what you think its impact will be in Colorado?
I don't know a lot yet about what it's going to do. I do know it got overwhelming bipartisan support. Like in the Senate, it passed like 92-8. Like what legislation passes 92-8 in our US Senate these days? Like almost nothing, right, Jane? And the reason, there are a couple reasons for that, but one reason is because every state derives benefits. I can tell you one specific thing that will happen, and that is that we, back in 2000, actually starting in the late 1990s, we helped to create the Great Sand Dunes National Park. Prior to, I think it became a park in 2000. Prior to that, it was a national monument. And the monument was threatened because there was a big water export scheme being proposed in the San Luis Valley that would have impacted the Great Sand Dunes ecosystem and Medno Creek. If you've been down there, Medno Creek is the creek that the kids love to play in, that you cross on your way to the sand dunes. And the water export scheme would have essentially dried up that creek. So we got involved and we bought 2 properties that are, they were totaled about 200,000 acres of land. One of them we still own. We still own actually quite a bit of that. But one of them, GOCO actually put in a ton of money, as did a couple of other federal sources. The monument became a park, but we still own a piece of private land on the ranch that we call the Medno Zapata. This is just, if you're driving into the dunes, it's just southwest of the dunes. And it's also, so lane 6 is the east-west that goes over the sand dunes, and to the south is the Zapata Ranch, to the north is the Medno Ranch. Lane 6 is the authorized boundary of the national park. Well, we still own land north of Lane 6. We're going to sell that land to the Park Service so they can make their entity whole. We're the last inholding within the park. That land will be then managed in full concert with everything else the Park Service is trying to do, and they're great land stewards. We will take the proceeds from that and redeploy it into other conservation, possibly including Fisher's Peak. The funding that is going to buy us out of Men Mill Ranch is Land and Water Conservation Fund. So that's one way that works, and one way it's going to hit down right here in Colorado. All right, thank you all so very much.